3 years ago, Bowdoin College up in Brunswick, Maine, acquired these previously unrecorded pictures of photographs, portraits made in Boston. And it's the last photograph of Fanny, I believe, taken before she died horrifically in a domestic accident, a fire in the home. And that's the last picture of Henry without the beard, because after that accident, in which he was severely burned himself, he grew the beard by which we know him. So these are quite wonderful pictures.
My name is Margaret Talcott, and I'm the Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. It's great to have you with us in this busy season and in this very strange time in the history of our country. After months of planning this particular event, it's especially nice to be introducing our guests this evening. I'll give you some background information on Nicholas, and Beth, my co-host at the State Library, will share Diana's bio. Including this book, Cross of Snow, Nicholas A. Basbanes is the author of 10 works of cultural history, including A Gentle Madness, Bibliophiles, Bibliomanes, and The Eternal Passion for Books, which that book was a finalist in 1995 for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Nonfiction, a great honor. Congratulations, Nick. His work on paper, the everything of its 2,000-year history, meaning on paper, history of paper, was a finalist for the 2014 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. Basbanes' essays, op-eds, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Humanities, Smithsonian, and Civilization. In 2016, he was named a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. It's great to have him here on a topic that he knows so well. Beth, welcome to you too.
Thank you, Margaret, and hello, everyone. I'm Beth Carroll Horrocks, the head of special collections at the State Library of Massachusetts. We're very glad to be here tonight for two main reasons. The first, of course, is Nick's wonderful book. And the second one is because this new format, this virtual format, has allowed us to expand our audience greatly and to enhance our collaborations with other institutions in the city of Boston. So that's been a great joy for us. So I'm going to tell you more about the State Library at the end of the program. But first, I'd like to introduce Nick's partner in tonight's conversation, Diana Korzenik. So Diana Korzenik is a two-time prize-winning author, artist, professor emerita at the Massachusetts College of Art. Relevant to Longfellow's is her research on 19th century Americans' passion to learn to draw that led her to write Drawn to Art, a 19th century American Dream, which was the winner of the Boston Globe's L.L. Winship Literary Award, and Objects of American Art Education, which was the winner of the Lieb Award from the American Library Association. She is the founder and first president of the Friends of Longfellow House. And from her 20-year fascination with Fanny Appleton Longfellow, she generated the Appleton Family Archive, now in Boston at American Ancestors New England Historical Genealogical Society. So 4 other of her research collections are housed at libraries and museums nationwide. So Diana claims responsibility for bringing Nick to the Longfellow House and convincing him to write about Fanny. So this should be a really great conversation. So over to you, Nick, to tell us about the Longfellows and your new book.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for inviting both Diana and myself to this wonderful program tonight. It is true, I go back 25 years with Diana. I was actually interviewing her for a book I was writing back in 1995, pardon me, called Patience and Fortitude, in which I was profiling the work of what I like to think of as scholar collectors. Scholars who collect valuable and rare and obscure things in pursuit of their work. And in fact, I did write about Diana in that book, but she kept urging me. We established a friendship, and she informed me that she was a founder of the Friends of the Longfellow House in Cambridge, Massachusetts on Brattle Street. And she kept urging me that there was a great story there that I should come and take a look at, or at least come and see the great treasures that reside there. It took me a few years to do that. I had other obligations, but finally in 2006, I visited. And in fact, I went and I wrote a piece for Smithsonian Magazine on the 200th anniversary of Henry Longfellow's birth. But I was just in awe of what I had found there. Not only this magnificent house, which I maintain is unique in the United States for any author, because it was the home not only of the author and his family, but everything there is original and authentic. And not only are the artifacts and the furnishings and the paintings and every manner of a thing. You talk about little things, pencil stubs that Henry saved from his poem, but many thousands of archival documents. It seemed to me that Henry Longfellow, who had been forgotten in the 20th century, one of easily our most celebrated poet of the 19th century, there was a remarkable story there that remained to be written about not only Henry, but of this amazing relationship with his second wife, Fanny Appleton Longfellow. Because the more I began to look into this, it occurred to me that there's 18 years of marriage. There was a 7-year courtship, so there's 25 years, but their 18 years of marriage coincided precisely with the 18 most productive, uninterrupted years of his productivity. Was there a story to be told there? Was there maybe perhaps some collaboration? Was this, I learned, and indeed there is an intellectual partnership to be looked at. And thus was born the idea for Cross of Snow, which derives its title from a sonnet Henry wrote towards the end of his life on the 18th anniversary of Fanny's horrific death, which we won't really get into tonight, but let's just say that it was a magnificent relationship, very fruitful, very loving, and that it ended in a heartbeat with a domestic accident that took her away in an overnight. And he wrote this poem, and he compared his grief to the size of a cross, the image of a cross on a mountain. And he said, such is the nature of his grief that he wears across his chest. And it just seemed to me, these 18 years, it seemed to me an architectural, a kind of a blueprint for me to pursue this book, which it took me now 7 or 8 years to do. I spent months and weeks, days at the Longfellow House at the Houghton Library. And I got together with Diana. Diana was doing some of her own work on the Appleton family. What is very interesting, Diana didn't see me as a rival at all in her work on the Appleton family at all. She was truly interested in Fanny Appleton before she became Fanny Longfellow. In fact, she might amend this a bit, but when she told me of her interest in Fanny, she said, "My interest in Fanny ends," I'm sure that this is an exaggeration, on the day she becomes Fanny Longfellow. And for that, I think that we'll invite Diana in shortly. I just want to show a couple of images, if I may. If we can begin with the first image of Henry. This is the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow as known and celebrated by the world at large. It was taken in 1868 during a magnificent trip he made to Europe. He was treated as visiting dignitary. He was received at Windsor Castle by Queen Victoria. He was given honorary degrees at Oxford and Cambridge. And in this photo by Julia Margaret Cameron, he is pictured on the Isle of Wight when he was visiting with Alfred Lord Tennyson. That, as I say, is the celebrated poet, translated in 30 languages throughout the world, more popular in England, in fact, when he visited there than Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning. And he remains to this day the only American to have a bust of his likeness installed in Westminster Abbey. This is a Longfellow known and celebrated and beloved by many. But let's see the next image. This is the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow known to both of his wives. He had 2 wives. The first wife, Mary Storer Potter Longfellow, which is who you will see in the next image, if you could show it now. There she is. Henry made a trip. He graduated from Bowdoin College at the age of 18, 4th in his class. Among his classmates and great friends was Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Henry, on his graduation day, was offered a position to be a professor of languages at Bowdoin College. But first, he had to go to Europe and learn these languages he would be expected to learn. He went, he traveled, he spent 3 years. He came back, he taught at Bowdoin for 7. And while he was there, he met this, he took up with this young woman from Portland who he knew from his youth. And it was a wonderful marriage, a beautiful marriage. And 4 years afterwards, he was appointed a similar professorship at Harvard College. But before he could accept it, he had to go to Europe and learn more languages. Mary was very reluctant to make this trip, but she made it. She was very supportive of her husband's ambitions. And she very sadly, very tragically died a month and a half after suffering a miscarriage. And Henry was grief-stricken. And I think he felt not only grief, he felt perhaps a tad of guilt, because Mary really didn't want to make this trip. But in any case, he soldiered on. He continued to learn his languages. And lo and behold, 7 or 8 months later, we can see the next slide, he met this young woman. Here she is, Frances Elizabeth Appleton, at the age of 17. About what she would have looked like when Henry met her, quite serendipitously in Switzerland, where she was making a grand tour of the continent, a 2-year tour. Her father was the Boston industrialist Nathan Appleton, who we'll learn about presently. This was followed by 2 weeks, the death of a brother from consumption, and 2.5 years after the death of her mother. So they were more or less grieving as well. And along with them was a consumptive cousin who they hoped would be restored to health. They met by chance in Switzerland. Henry had been doing work, learning languages, and he finally said, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to go out on a tour of the fatherland, of the Rhineland. And lo and behold, there was something wrong with his paperwork. He couldn't go into Italy. He took a turn and went into Switzerland and Interlaken. He met the Appleton family from Boston and was invited to travel with them for a fortnight. And thus begins our story. And now I would ask Diana to kind of enter the conversation. Diana, this is the Fanny Appleton that you knew and studied so well. And I think among the many items that you researched, and you actually, I think you gave this particular journal its name, is the Spiritual Journal, which Fanny began writing when she was about 13 years old, following the death of her mother. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that and your involvement in the Appleton family.
I want to say a little bit before that about your and my dialogue and how, as you referred to our relationship. What's so interesting in this conversation is that we're dealing with the same materials, but as a man and a woman, we read these materials quite differently. And I think that's really rich to deal with as we go through these lives. I see Fanny's adolescent journals as in some ways prototypical for many adolescent journals. There's a whole genre within women's studies of adolescent journals. But this young woman, who was born in 1817, was born into a house full of art, a house full of writing and literature from a father who was a poetry writer and a mother who had artistic aspirations. They were art collectors who did the first founding. Their collection was the first founding exhibit at the Boston Athenaeum. So this young woman, who Nick said grew up in this privileged house in Beacon Hill, also had tremendous opportunities, but also had tremendous grief. And Nick had outlined what the griefs were. And in Fanny's adolescent journals, this is what I call the Spiritual Journal, she starts with powerful words. She said, let me write, let me write out myself, let me spread out my heart as a map whereon I might gaze. And I claim that she is like a 21st century woman doing a kind of self-analysis. She's a psychologist as well as an exquisite writer. And in her probing for who am I, she turns from talking to herself to talking to God. And I think it's a very important part of the story that in 19th century New England, people lived with God. They had relationships to God. It wasn't an affectation to say that. She maintained from 1833 to 1852 a diary in which she was writing to God. So I could go through with other quotes, but she really does what I see as a series of self-portraits as she matures. And Nick, you wanted to compare this with Henry's journal with the horse drawing.
Well, the spiritual journal actually was not the image we just showed. That's an image from her actual diary, her European diary. But I thought because we're talking here about the youth, and I mentioned Henry's first trip to Europe. This is before he met Mary. 3 years. Imagine you graduate from Bowdoin College in 1825. You're 18 years old, and your family really trusts you to go unaccompanied to Europe for what amounts to 3 years. And Henry really, and you see him, this is a self-portrait that he makes in his journal. And I photographed every page of this journal over 50 years at the Houghton Library at Harvard. And I love this one because here he is in native garb. He's quoting Byron, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and he's to horse. When he's in Spain, he dresses as a Spaniard. When he's in Italy, he dresses as an Italian. He's on Enrique and Enrico. Henri takes different names when he's not takes different names, but his names in the local language. And not only is he learning these languages, and he becomes a translator of extraordinary note, but he's absorbing the literatures which he will introduce to American readers. And this is just a page from his journal. And this is the journal of a 19-year-old young man. I call that chapter Awakening, because he has a number of relationships with women, young women, during this journey. And it's very indicative of the great respect he has for women throughout his life, because in 2 of these instances, in Spain, Florencia Gonzalez, she teaches him Spanish. And he actually extends his stay there for 6 months, to the chagrin of his father, who wants him to hurry up and get home and start teaching at Bowdoin. And then he gets to Italy, and he lives with the Persiani family, and Julia teaches him Italian. And but his Italian, his Spanish, his German, he learns multiple languages, is just quite remarkable. But he has relationships with these women, but that he's very respectful of throughout his life. There's a great quote that he makes when he's lecturing at Harvard in 1839, and he's actually talking about Dante. But he said, nowhere in Dante, nowhere will you ever find a single disrespectful word about any woman any woman at all. And I maintain you can actually say the same thing about Henry Longfellow. And then I think going to Fanny Longfellow, her journals, I estimate there are 200,000 words that she wrote just during that European journey, which are quite magnificent, not only of her observations, but of the art. And you, of course, were looking at her as this young artist. And this, I think, is one of the reasons that attracted you to looking at her in the first instance, is that there was no formal education for these young women. And yet,
Well,
sure, bring it, come on.
there wasn't formal education as we knew it. But in 1811, when her mother was recently married, John Reuben Smith, a master from the Royal Academy in London, came to Boston to set up an art academy. And there was a whole lot of interest around John Reuben Smith's instruction. And Fanny, clearly, her drawing books that survive at Longfellow House show her studying from the John Reuben Smith's drawing books that were published in Boston. And her mother was part of that circle of women who attended his school. So she was as close as could be to the center of art activity in Boston.
And also they lived on 39 Beacon Street, which is just a couple of yards down from the great State House at Beacon Hill, and very close to the Boston Athenaeum, where her father was a principal. And that was very important because the Athenaeum then was also an art museum. This is years before the Museum of Fine Arts opens in Boston, which the Appleton family were very influential in forming. And Aunt Fanny and her sister Mary, they're allowed to go and look at the artworks. If she writes in her journal once, saw Audubon's original sketches today. It's quite amazing.
Very important to emphasize what you just said. Women were allowed, the only part of the Athenaeum that women could enter was the art gallery. It's hard again for us to realize how constrained a woman's access was to the culture of Boston. So the art gallery was a very special place. Maria could take her daughters as well as her sons to the art gallery where their art was shown.
Something else Maria did that was essential and is quite extraordinary. is that she arranged for her daughter's private tutoring. We know this because two letters survive from Elizabeth Palmer Peabody to Nathan Appleton. And in the first instance, she introduces herself because having been referred to by the mother, who was a cousin, who had been referred to Elizabeth Palmer Peabody by Catherine Maria Sedgwick. And this is, of course, the great, great teacher of young girls. And Fanny was tutored not only by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, but by George Barrow Emerson, by Francis Grader, she learned dance from Lorenzo Papanti, and Henry hired Francis Lieber to come in and teach them languages. What's quite remarkable about these opportunities, these opportunities that she had, is how she embraced this.
Exactly, exactly.
Thank you. Yeah, you carry the ball on this one because this is so essential. Not only did she get this education, she embraced it. Go ahead.
She was like a sponge. She wanted it all and she wanted to use it. All her writing is an exercise in practicing everything she was taught, everything that interested her. In fact, you mentioned Elizabeth Peabody. Her critique of Fanny as a child in her
classic
was that she was only interested in what she was interested in.
And bored by the things that she was
interested in, she didn't let go of.
Yeah, she's wonderful.
And she just pursued. She had a great confidence in her own intellectual and emotional abilities in a very mysterious way. Her sister, Mary, did not have that.
Although Mary was quite brilliant in her own right, and Henry had a wonderful relationship, an epistolary relationship with Mary. I mean, they respected each other's minds. But Fanny, he was when he met her, that young woman, 17 or 18, you read her journal, and she's not just writing about what we did today. She is evaluating paintings. She is evaluating architecture. She's telling you about operas that she goes to see. She's telling you about plays, and with insight and beautiful writing, that really leaves you, dazzles me. And she's 18 years old, and with such insights, when she goes and visits the Colosseum at night, and she wants to see the Colosseum for the first time by moonlight, and she goes with a group of Americans who are really boorish, and they are so disrespectful. She fulminates. She writes 3 or 4 pages. She's furious at how they ruined this experience for her for seeing the. She's absolutely, and this is the young woman that I think I'd like to show. We've already looked at an excerpt from her diary, but let's show the sketch that we have that she made.
Oh, yeah.
Now this is magnificent, and this it's just one of many. She made multiple sketches. When she traveled on this trip to Europe, she brought notebooks, she brought art supplies, sketchbooks. She had another album that she put plant specimens in from Cicero's grave, from Beach Rock and Vaucluse. So she's constantly busy. But what I love about this particular sketch made in Naples is that clearly is our young Miss Appleton in the lower right. I think of that, there's no doubt. And by the way, she's tall, statuesque, 5 feet 10 inches tall. Henry is 5'8". So I mean, not only is she imposing as a brilliant young woman with these piercing eyes, but her stature is erect, and she actually kind of dominates a room. And everyone seems to say this about her. What I love, in one instance, all these young men are flowing around her. She calls them the beaux. Yeah. She's batting them away like moths. And in one instance, she's coming out of a museum, and there they are. And one of the young men tries to impress her with his knowledge of art. And she said, unfortunately, another person who sees only with his eyes.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. See only with his eyes and not his mind.
I'm that we get to the period of their courtship, because
which I think we have to get to right about now, by the way.
We haven't dealt with that. I want to make the claim that I see that she was doing within this spiritual work. She was trying to figure out who she was and what kind of life she wanted for herself and how she could best use her talents. And being in a couple was a very troubling matter to her. Her parents had not been a happy couple. They virtually lived at opposite ends of the state very often. And she didn't have a model for couples that made being in a couple particularly attractive. And meanwhile, she was very engaged with her own intellectual life and with friendships that grew in the cultured world she was part of. So it was, why don't you talk a bit more, Nick, about Henry's side of this? But she really was struggling. When you write about Henry, it sounds like you see his frustration, but she's also frustrated. She doesn't know how to do this thing.
Well, not only that, he's far more impressed with her than she is with him. I mean, she likes him. There's no question about it. But any thought that there's an epiphany here on both sides, that just isn't the case. Henry runs into the Appleton family in Interlaken. He introduces himself to Nathan Appleton, who apparently likes him. He likes the cut of his jib because he invites him to join the family for a fortnight. And they travel in carriages together, and they read books to each other. They speak German and Italian to one another. Henry's first reaction to her, which he writes to his friend George Washington Green some months later, he said, she's striking, she's beautiful, but she is not just a woman of talent, she is a woman of genius. He is most struck by her mind, and she will argue with him. I mean, young women didn't do this and that time. She's 18 years old. She disagrees with him strongly on literary matters, and she says so in her journal. And he apparently is so dazzled with her that when he returns home to take up his teaching duties at Harvard, he starts walking into Boston from Harvard Square, walking in his new European finery up to Beacon Hill, making their acquaintance. But, there are no love letters between Henry and Fanny. I mean, there were maybe 6 or 7 letters, which you could actually call love letters, because really for 7 years, he courts her. And he really, he darn near has a nervous breakdown over, I wouldn't call it an outright rejection, but she's not interested. She says she wants to be friends.
I'm going to differ with you a little on that.
Okay, good, please.
I don't think she wasn't interested. I think she was tormented. She didn't know how to negotiate the who she was with the who he was. And he was obviously very important to her in her writing. She talks about her struggles. And also they were in the same social circle. I have this drawing, I don't know if you can see it, but it's one of my favorite finds, where in 1837, they would run into each other at parties because they were in the same neighborhood. Their social world was in this way.
George Ticknor's house up on the corner of Park Avenue in Beacon, he had these marvelous soirees. But you mentioned that she goes to a party at Ticknor's one night, and they have music, they look at art, and she never once mentions that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was there. And we know he was there because in his own journal for the night, he talks about the devil put my foot in it, and I went up there, and there was Miss Fanny, and he called her the stately dark lady, and she paid no attention to him. And by the way, we should mention before we go on to their marriage that he writes a novel, a roman à clef, a romance which he calls Hyperion. I argue the second dumbest thing he ever did in his life. The dumbest thing, insisting that Mary goes to Europe with him on that first trip, but deciding to write a book and to discuss with breathless adoration and confession his passion for this young woman he calls Mary Ashburton. He's Paul Fleming. And thinking that somehow this is going to win her affections when it just absolutely has the opposite effect altogether. I mean, it took 7 years. I think it might have taken 3 or 4 without Hyperion. I don't know if you feel that way.
That she was struggling. I think that's a really important difference.
I think that's a point we could pursue in conversation. But
yeah.
And maybe you're seeing this from a woman's perspective more than I am. But again, I'm going by what I read in the documents and in the letters. But it's absolutely a valid point.
She talks about how she wants to be useful. How can she be useful? What is love? Where does she fit in to to what's possible. Remember, this is a woman who couldn't go to many places where men were. Henry's world was largely men, and now celebrated men.
We should also mention, before we move on to the years of their marriage, her passion for the Berkshires. And of course, that's where her mother was from. Her mother was consumptive. She would go out there every opportunity that she could. But Fanny, during these years, these 7 years, she actually prevailed upon her father to buy her 35 acres of land overlooking the Housatonic River, where she could build what she called a castle in Spain, where she could have like a little villa where she and Mary could have these little soirees. And this, of course, the Berkshires was kind of like a lake district, very, very welcoming to the artistic people, but to women. And of course, who lives out there but Catherine Maria Sedgwick, this great woman writer of the period, the only woman to be profiled in Homes of American Authors, 1853. And to Fanny reaches out to Catherine Sedgwick not long after her mother dies, after she writes that letter that you mentioned in a spiritual journal, seeking a mentor, seeking someone who will help her make decisions. And I argue that it's really Sedgwick that turns the day. Says,
You're right. In part, it's Sedgwick. She writes the letter saying, how could you turn down this
she says, Fanny, I met your Professor L last night. Fanny, what beau ideal are you looking for?
I think we should also list the other things that made her change her mind. For one thing, one of Fanny's great gifts was she said, I enjoy nothing more than being proven wrong and for changing my mind. And about this marriage, she changed her mind. And it was she was tipped. The scales were tipped because her sister had married, her father had remarried and started a new family. Reverend William Ellery Channing, who was very important to her, had just died. And then finally...
And then Tom was going to Europe.
Her Reverend family was disappearing, going to Europe. So she says to Henry, will you come comfort me? And that's the beginning of the...
And I think this was kind of set up in Shady Hill in Cambridge. This was at the Norton House. Catherine Elliott Norton, I think, kind of arranged for them to be in a little alcove together, and they chat, and then he explains to her what his intentions were with Hyperion. And Diana, I think one of the most important things that happens that when they are married on July 13th, 1843, in Nathan Appleton's magnificent townhouse at 39 Beacon Street, overlooking Boston Garden by candlelight, as a wedding present, this is the daughter of Nathan Appleton, a textile, the founder of Lowell, Massachusetts, the textile city, who could really have given her anything, her husband anything. What she gives Henry, this is one of the extraordinary material objects that I found in the Longfellow house, is the sketchbook, this magnificent sketchbook that she made during the trip to Europe when they met, with her fabulous sketches. And on the front paste down, she has written, Mary Ashburton to Paul Fleming. Those are the names of the characters in Hyperion, which had caused so much disunion. And in a way, she's quoting from his Psalm of Life, let the dead past, let the buried. Magnificent artifact, which tells you everything you need to know about how they had buried the hatchet. And for the day they're married. And why don't we, at this point, show the photograph of Longfellow House when we talk about this
wedding present.
Yeah, that's right. Here we are. This is my photograph, and I actually photographed it in all 4 seasons. I'm only going to show you summer, but I just can't get enough of this place. It's Colonial Mansion. Should briefly note that it was the command headquarters of George Washington during the siege of Boston, during the Revolutionary War. And that's very important because the Longfellows were once they became a couple, and her father, Nathan Appleton, bought this home for them as a wedding present. Henry had been living there for half a dozen years as a boarder. Now he and Fanny owned it. They were very mindful of the fact that it was Washington's headquarters. Very early, I mean, this isn't being done. Nathan Appleton would much rather they had moved to Beacon Hill, but there was a rule then that Harvard faculty had to be living in Cambridge, so they were going to stay in Cambridge. And they were very mindful that we are going to preserve the character of the home. This is way ahead of its time. I mean, There are people that would have maybe torn the thing down, nuked it, and built something else, but they wanted to maintain the character of this magnificent structure. And this is where I call it Camelot on the Charles. And we are so fortunate. Fanny kept these wonderful journals, but into her marriage, she only kept the journal for 1 year. And now I guess we can get into the actual intellectual partnership of the two.
The spiritual journal goes through 1852.
It does, but the actual daily journal where she's recording and documenting the events, and her first year of marriage living in what she calls Craigie Castle, because it was known as Craigie House for the previous Elizabeth Craigie, another woman who Henry had a wonderful, respectful. She was his landlady. And actually, he gave Mrs. Craigie that portrait of Mary that I showed you earlier because he couldn't bear to look at it, but he wanted somebody who would take care of it. And it kind of came back to the house. But they lived there, and she called it Craigie Castle. And that first year of their marriage, the strongest argument that we can make for this symbiosis of minds, this intellectual partnership, is what she writes about that first. During their honeymoon, Charles Sumner comes along, the senator, Henry's dearest male friend. I mean, he has a group. By the way, the relationships I write about in this book are not just female. I mean, his male friendships are very strong and very important. Charles Sumner, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Charles Dickens, when they visit back and forth. So they're very important friendships. Charles Sumner took him a number of years before he took a wife. John Stauffer, the Harvard, who's writing a biography of Sumner, told me one of the reasons he thought Sumner, who knew the Appletons very, very well, he was related to Nathan Appleton's second wife. One of the reasons he took him a long time to find a wife is he could never find a clone of Fanny Appleton. He said, because what these people, these men of a certain stature wanted, it wasn't money. Money is important, stature is everything, but it was an intellectual equal, an intellectual partner. And Sumner agreed, everyone agreed who met this young woman that she not only was bright, she was brilliant. And George William Curtis calls her Aspasia. I mean, he writes about her as Aspasia to Pericles, which is a great. You actually pointed me in that direction. This is a writer who actually, the only book he ever dedicates is not to his own wife, but to Mrs. Henry W. Longfellow in memory of our conversations at our castles in Spain, which is a phrase that she uses to describe these imaginary places, these very wonderful literary conversations.
I think we should make it clear before we end that this idea that there was this collaborative.
Oh, yes. And I think that if we don't talk about anything else before we close off, it should be that, because during that first year of marriage, on their honeymoon, Sumner comes. They go visit the arsenal at Springfield. She implores her husband to write what she calls a peace poem. It's the Springfield Armory, using as a central image the weapons, the thousands of muskets, and make it the devil's organ, because she's such a pacifist and she has an aversion to weapons. And then during the first year of marriage, they're working on a 2-volume anthology of European poetry, 10 different national literatures that Henry has translated, and she's working with them. She says, we translated a bit of the Swedish today, the Danish, the Icelandic. I worked a bit on the preface. She calls it our book. It's astonishing. And we have to show this. Yes, thank you for putting this up. This is an example of their first documentable collaboration, and it was actually done during that first trip when they met, not the trip, but when they met in Germany, and they stopped by a brook, and together they translated this poem from the German, which translates the castle by the sea. Henry would use her translation in Hyperion. He would say her translation was better than his. And she apparently felt the same, because this is Fanny's handwritten copy, which is an Appletoniana, another thing that you might talk about. And look who she gives top billing to, not to Henry Longfellow, but to Fanny E. Appleton, by the margins of fair Zurich's waters. So yes, they work together. And then later, during their marriage, she's not keeping a diary, but she's writing magnificent letters. And she writes most authoritatively to her friends. She writes about Evangeline. She writes about Hiawatha. She writes about the making of Miles Standish. And she says one thing in that letter about Miles Standish, which really bears reading. she says, during the composition of the Courtship of Miles Standish, she writes to one of Henry's sisters that Henry has been writing a poem of some length. This is 1858. And we sit in the summer house, this is on the Hunt, and correct proof and discuss this line and that these sunny days. I am ashamed to say, this is he's being so self-effacing here, to say that he always takes my suggestions, which may not improve the poem. Well, I think he absolutely took her suggestions all the time. She and Sumner prevailed upon him to change the building of the ship, the poem, The Building of the Ship, and which changed, which transformed it. It put that line in there, sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union, strong and great. That went in the night before. It was to go off to press. And that was Sumner and Fanny that prevailed upon him to make that change. So it's quite a remarkable collaboration, and it was 18 uninterrupted years.
And now I just want to underline that that was what was so fulfilling to her. She felt useful in this role.
Yep. And you know, here we're showing here, because I guess we have to move quick shortly to the Q&A. But 3 years ago, Bowdoin College up in Brunswick, Maine, acquired these previously unrecorded pictures of photographs, portraits made in Boston. And it's the last photograph of Fanny, I believe, taken before she died horrifically in a domestic accident, a fire in the home. And that's the last picture of Henry without the beard, because after that accident, in which he was severely burned himself, he grew the beard by which we know him. So these are quite wonderful pictures. I would wonder if we have time to show that one more slide of Henry, the sketch Henry made of Fanny and the sketch Fanny made of Henry. Yeah, there they are. This is the only known sketch that each one made of the other. The great highlight of the day, this is a good one to end on before we take questions. The great highlight of the day, this is what you wanted me to write about, in fact, in the first instance. You wanted me to come and look at the Longfellows and their books, which is fascinating. They read to she read to him every day because he was impassioned by her musical voice.
And his eyes were bad.
And his eyes were bad, but he loved to listen to her. And that's a sketch she made of him reclining in the study. And that's a sketch he made of her, same year, 1847, reclining in the study. So I guess we have to go to a Q&A now, as much as
I have so many wonderful questions coming in for you all. Okay. I have to say, we've been hearing from many of Fanny's relatives.
Oh, good.
And it's fascinating. More people are claiming Fanny as their relative than Longfellow. And of course, I'm sure many are both. But anyway, a number of the Appleton descendants want to ask you, Diana, where you did your research in terms of your archives. And also we want to hear what archives you've given to New England Historic Genealogical Society, and where should these descendants go to find material about their relatives?
Okay, the materials I found, I began at Longfellow House. I began transcribing. There had never been a transcription of the letters and the journals that are in Longfellow House. So I began with that. I began with the spiritual journal just by good fortune. But then I ended up looking for letters all over the country and finding them in libraries in different locations. And the letters are not, the Appleton Family Archives actually begins with her parents' archives. It's letters from her mother in the 18th century, and her father when he goes to Paris, and it was the first, when the Louvre has just opened. So you're seeing this whole family take form. It's not centered only around Fanny. It includes Tom's letters, it includes Mary's letters and Charlie's letters, and helps you understand how this family educated their children as a family. So the archive is much bigger than Fanny and Henry's stories, and they are letters and journals and drawings from all over the country. But it all began at Longfellow House on Brattle Street in Cambridge.
Wonderful. Well, that's where you Appleton descendants should go. I'm sure you've been, but go back.
And also the Massachusetts Historical Society, which has quite an extensive Appleton family archive, I think is.
Right. And the Sedgwick papers are there.
Sedgwick papers are there as well.
The point of the archives was to pull together the documents of these interrelated people, because they really, as Nick and I have shown, they're all in dialogue in letters. So if you see only one side, you don't see the other side. And I wanted the letters to come together as much as possible.
Thank you. Beth?
So this next question also comes from an Appleton descendant who wants to know more about how Fanny served as a muse to Henry and how his writing changed after her death.
Well, that's good.
Want me to take that one, Diana?
Take that, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, Henry only wrote one, what we can actually call one love poem, and it was a sonnet, and that was to Fanny. And it was the Evening Star, the Sweet Hesper. I can't do it from memory, so I won't try. So he really didn't write that many love poems. I guess you could call Across the Snow a love poem, but that's a mourning poem. But as a muse, I think and this is more to the point of your question, after her death, he wrote in his journal, I can't write anything original. And when I can't write anything original, I turn to translation. And what he turned to at this time, it's most significant, is because for 20 years he had been working on and off on translating all of Dante, of which he was the American authority by far. The entire, and of course, you probably know of the Dante Club, the novel written about the people, the scholars who came to meet with him in Longfellow House. But he turned to completing the translation of Dante into English, and he became the first American to do it in its entirety. And that translation is still regarded as, Harold Bloom, the late Harold Bloom, told me it's his favorite. Robert Pinsky has the highest regard for it. Nemerov has the highest regard for any number of different people. James Merrill has the highest regard for Longfellow's translation of Dante because of its fidelity to the original, and also the fact that as a wonderful poet, he maintained original rhyme schemes. You couldn't do the terza rima, but you could do kind of an iambic pentameter sort of structure. But what he also did something very original with his translation of Dante. He wrote 6 sonnets, 2 of which to introduce each of the 3 parts, Purgatory, Paradise, and Inferno. And these were very definitely influenced by Fanny, especially the image of Beatrice and Dante's passion, lifelong passion for Beatrice. You can definitely see echoes of Beatrice and Fanny and Beatrice and Henry's. And I might write something about that at some point. But you can really see it there. His poetry really changed when he returned to original composition. It was not the same as it was during the years of their marriage. His first book of real poetry after Dante was. Of his own poetry was Tales of a Wayside Inn, but he basically repurposed things that he had already done. Paul Revere's Ride became the Landlord's Tale as the opening thing and opening poem in Tales of a Wayside Inn. So when you read that, please go read the song. I won't try and do it for you from memory. I could, but go please read the Cross of Snow sonnet. It's 14 lines. It's a contemplation of 2 paintings. The painting of his wife that hangs in the bedroom, that only he sees each night in the long sleepless watches of the night. A gentle face, the face of one long dead, looks at me from the wall where round its head the night lamp casts a halo of pale light. And then here in this room she died, he writes. And then he turns his attention to this giant mountain which had recently been discovered in the Rockies, in the Colorado Rockies, which displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my chest these 18 years, through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died. So if that's not influencing his work as a poet, and that remained unpublished in his lifetime. He wrote it out, dated it. It was the 18th anniversary of her death. They'd been married 18 years, numbers mattered to him. He tucked it in an envelope, and it was discovered after his death. And when I saw that I decided that would be the title of my book.
Nick, that was beautiful. What a beautiful poem. We do have a question from someone that they believe he stopped writing after she died. Is that true?
No, well, there was a period, I think he was fearful that he was losing his mind. I mean, he confessed to friends he was delirious, and plus he had injuries. And I think Diana was, I mean, he was taking some ether and something, and he physically couldn't attend the funeral of his wife because he was injured. And dozens of people came through the house. He could hear them visiting, but he couldn't be there with her. So obviously he didn't write poetry for a while. What he did turn to, I mean, she dies in 1861, and he returns to the translation of Dante, and that takes him up through the 1860s. It's published in 3 volumes. And then he does Tales of a Wayside Inn, and he goes back to other things. But there was very definitely a period following her death where he was just unable to write, as he said, original things.
Can I bring her back to life for a moment? A number of folks have been tantalized by your descriptions of Europe, and we're just curious, they want to know what European countries they visited. Did they go as a family? Did they bring their children?
You're talking about the Appletons now, or
yes? No, actually, I'm talking about Fanny and Henry.
Yeah, well, they traveled separately. Now we have to understand that. So when, again, Fanny's older brother Charlie, 20 years old, dies of consumption. Nathan Appleton, who was a congressman for a term, he was a very wealthy man. He decides on an impulse, I'm taking my daughters to Europe, and they leave in 2.5. And actually, this is going to segue you into the final reading, so it works. So in 2.5 weeks, they sail. He makes plans. We're going to sail on the Francis de Paul. We're going to Europe, and they're there for 2 years. They go to England. They start in France. They spend a lot of time in France in the winter. They spend a lot of time in the summer in Italy. They go to Germany. They come back through Switzerland, and then they spend time in England, and then they come home. By the way, while she's there, she's painted by Jean-Paul Isabey, which a painting which hung for a while in the Louvre. It's now in the dining room at Craigie House. She's sculpted in Florence by Lorenzo Bartolini, the famous sculptor, and that sculpture with the ringlets, beautiful, kind of parallels that sketch that she made of herself in Naples. That's in the house. So it's an amazing trip, and it's not only is it a 2-year trip, it's made at the very highest levels. She meets in Italy, the Grand Duke. I mean, she dances till midnight. They stay at magnificent places. It's really quite an extraordinary.
We're enormously jealous.
Yeah. And then Henry did kind of, when again, he was a kid, and he made his first trip for 3 years. He was France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and then and then when he went back 10 years later with his first wife, he was now focusing on Scandinavian languages. He went up and learned 6 languages up there, and then he's really focused on the German, which is what he really needed if he was going to take over the Harvard job. He was succeeding George Ticknor, the great George Ticknor, who was the founding spirit of the Boston Public Library and namesake of the Ticknor Society in Boston, which is the Bibliophilic Society. So they were well-traveled. They were cosmopolitans. I mean, before Henry called himself a cosmopolite, a traveler, and he envisioned himself doing this. And Oliver Goldsmith and Lord Byron and Washington Irving was his great hero, and he gets to meet Washington Irving when he's in Spain. And Irving impresses upon him, not only must you learn the languages, but you must absorb the literatures. It's very critical because he introduces these languages to American readers. No fewer than 25 German writers, including Goethe and Schiller, he introduces to American readers. Fredrika Bremer, the Swedish writer, she comes to the United States and he speaks to her in her own tongue. And she credits him with translating Tegner and others and the great books that he acquired. He also acquired books for Harvard as he went from country to country. So he was kind of being an antiquarian book hunter while he was doing these things. But it can be argued that he is really one of our very first multiculturalists because he really absorbed and he preached about it. He once said, he wrote a letter to his sisters, the more languages a person learns, the more lives he or she lives. And he really believed that foreign languages and literatures produced this multicultural kind of person, decades before the phrase was even introduced.
Diana, before we go to the final reading, did you want to add anything to what was said?
put a little damper on that everything was perfect. That seems to be my role in this dialogue. And Fanny got very sick in Germany, in Mainz, Germany. After being with Henry, I think it was a really physiological response to the stress of what am I going to do with this man? And she thought she was dying. Both sisters got very sick. This was not a charmed forever after kind of trip.
Well, they had an ailing cousin with them who died.
It was a death in the
She was
family.
nursing that cousin.
People kept dying in Europe. It was awful. I loved the book, but the people dying in Europe was distressing.
Well, I just wrote an essay for Humanities Magazine. It's dealing with death and contagion. It was commonplace throughout the 19th century. More people died of consumption than any other cause. And it struck across all demographics. I mean, her mother, her brother, her cousin, and nobody really understood how it struck. And then we have Mary dying after a miscarriage. It's a horrible situation. But
Beth, before we go to Nick's final reading, anything more you want to say, or should we let him go to? He promised me it'd be inspirational, but go ahead, Beth. Anything else?
Well, I've picked two very brief segments, and they're separated by 25 years. And the first one I've chosen, I guess it works pretty well, because on that first, I wanted my readers to meet Fanny, the woman that Henry meets in Europe. I wanted my readers to see this amazing woman who dazzles everybody that she confronts. And when she makes this trip to Europe on the Francis de Paula, the sailing vessel, she keeps a very good diary. And the captain of the ship, he's 55 years old. I actually had to search and find out his name. I found it at the Mystic Seaport Museum. From the very first instant, they become fast friends. He teaches her how to navigate at sea. He teaches her about sails. He teaches her about tacking against the wind, celestial navigation. But she writes at one point, she writes in her diary and also to a friend back home, what she desires more than anything else. She has this extraordinary eagerness to learn and to see things. She wants to experience a real storm. So I'll just pick up in this a real storm at sea, because she wants to see what it's like. So I'll pick it up here. Fanny would finally getting her wish. Fanny, I'm quoting from her here. Fanny crawled up to the slippery deck one afternoon to witness the relentless pounding of the ship. The other passengers prudently huddling in their staterooms, many of them suffering from the mal de coeur that eluded her throughout the voyage. With the wind, these are her quotes, rushing like the blast of 1,000 trumpets, she remained clinging to the top rail mast, awed, bewildered, till a tumultuous wave broke over my head, drenching me to the skin. What an exulting thrill of sheer delight to be baptized by such a priest at such an altar, a child of the tempest. I call that chapter Child of the Tempest. How could I not? And then finally, jumping ahead 25 years, we heard from Fanny. Now let's hear from Henry. As we've discussed it, as Diana has discussed, and as the questions were asked, Henry was unable even to answer correspondence, letters. Condolences came in from all over the world. Again, his wife died horrifically in a domestic accident. Her dress caught fire while she was sealing lockets of hair. In an instant, his life was turned upside down. And he wrote a letter finally. It took him a month, but he wrote a letter to Mary Appleton Mackintosh, who had married the son of a British diplomat and was living in London, so she wasn't at home. But she finally wrote to Mary, and Mary and Fanny were exceedingly close. So he writes this in part: I feel that only you and I knew her thoroughly. You can understand what an inexpressible delight she was to me, always and in all things. I never looked at her without a thrill of pleasure. She never came into a room where I was without my heart beating quicker, nor went out without my feeling that something of the light went with her. I loved her so entirely, and I know she was very happy. And leave it with that.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Diana. We obviously did not get to all of the questions that had come in. I just wanted to mention quickly that quite a few people were interested in the journaling aspect of Fanny's life. So maybe that's something, Diana, you could write about next.
Well, I have multiple chapters in my book devoted.
And oh, all right. And we can have people buy and read your book, which brings me to my next comment, which is that frequently after these talks, people tell us that, well, they thought they knew a lot about the topic. After hearing the talk and reading the book, they discovered that there's so much more to learn. So I hope you'll all be able to read Nick's book. You can see on your screen right now 3 images of the State Library. The one on the left and the right are our main reading room, which is a gorgeous space to work. And I hope that you'll all feel welcome after this epidemic is over and the State House is open again, that to come and see what we have available for you in the State Library. We have great resources. And there we go. These are just some examples of the kinds of things we have. It mostly relates to Massachusetts history, especially its government and legislation, but we have a wide variety of materials. And while most of it does not circulate, you're welcome to come and visit us in the State House once we're reopened. So these are just a few teaser images to show you the kinds of materials that we have. And then on the next slide, you can see, I was surprised. I went last week to find out what we had for Longfellow and found a huge amount of material. So there's surprises and good things to learn all the time. These are a few samples of our Longfellow holdings.
Please know that at American Ancestors NEHGS, our doors, our virtual doors are wide open to any of you who are researching your family's history or the history of another families like the Longfellows or the Appletons. You can connect with our genealogists on the phone, over Twitter, or through our AmericanAncestors.org website, where you'll also find downloadable research guides and free educational resources. For those of you who are steeped in the 19th century, there are numerous archives that we have there and documents, personal papers, military records, town and government filings, and other unique primary sources that can inform your research. And if you're looking for 19th century people, we have lots of online databases that have that birth to death, we've got you covered. Nick's book is full of Boston and Cambridge families, places such as Nahant, places such as the Berkshires, and we have records on all these various things. So please join us when we open up, hopefully when this pandemic ends. We had people coming in before and we'll have people again. Thank you to all of our guests tonight. It was such an honor and a pleasure to hear from you and to get even more education than we already have on this topic. Nick, Diana, really, 3 cheers to you. And we wish all of you at home a safe and an inspirational evening, a happy holiday season. And we say thank you and good night.